Every moment presents itself exactly as it is. The world does not bend to desire, nor do thoughts and feelings yield to force. You cannot command calm, nor can you summon peace by pushing away discomfort. Yet so often, we treat life as if it must conform to our wishes, and we mistake struggle for progress. The Stoics observed this centuries ago. It is not events themselves that disturb us, but our judgments about them. Understanding this is the first step toward freedom. We spend much of our lives chasing what we think will make us complete, assuming that satisfaction lies in external outcomes. Recognition, wealth, success, these appear to promise fulfillment, yet each attempt to grasp them tightens the grip of tension instead of releasing it. The mind, when forced, resists. Effort applied to controlling what cannot be controlled only strengthens the power of what troubles us. This paradox is subtle, yet it is at the heart of human restlessness. True steadiness does not come from shaping the world to our liking, nor from erasing discomfort. It comes from attending to what is within our control, our perception, our judgment, our responses. By cultivating this inner clarity, we begin to move through life without being consumed by every thought or feeling. Peace emerges not as a prize to be won, but as a natural byproduct of understanding, discipline, and mindful attention. This is the path the Stoics walked, and it remains relevant now as much as it was centuries ago. The mind often behaves in ways that surprise us. The more you try to suppress a thought, the more it dominates attention. The more you resist a feeling, the more it shapes your experience. This is not a failure of willpower. It is the nature of awareness itself. Thoughts and emotions cannot be forced into compliance. They arise, persist, and fade according to patterns that are often beyond direct control. When we attempt to manipulate them through sheer effort, we inadvertently give them energy and significance. What we call suffering often emerges not from circumstances themselves, but from the struggle against them, the insistence that reality be different from what it is. Stoics understood this deeply. Marcus Aurelius wrote, "You have power over your mind, not outside events. Realize this, and you will find strength." The insight is clear. The locus of control lies within, and freedom is found not by battling the contents of consciousness, but by changing the relationship to them. This pattern extends to the desires we cling to. We believe that fulfillment lies in achieving something external, recognition, wealth, validation. And yet, the harder we pursue these things as a source of satisfaction, the more fragile our sense of contentment becomes. Every unmet expectation, every delay, every perceived failure reinforces the sense that we lack something essential. Seneca observed, "It is not the man who has too little, but the man who craves more, that is poor." Desire, when conflated with necessity, traps the mind in a cycle of perpetual chasing. True stability emerges only when we loosen the attachment to outcomes and allow life to unfold without constant judgment or compulsion. By observing desire rather than being driven by it, we reclaim a measure of calm that effort alone cannot create. The process of letting go does not require withdrawal or passivity. Action continues, responsibility remains, and life proceeds. The difference lies in the orientation of the mind. When the focus shifts from controlling outcomes to observing and responding, clarity emerges. Thoughts lose their weight, emotions lose their intensity, and the persistent tension of expectation begins to dissolve. What was once a constant undercurrent of anxiety and self-judgment begins to recede. Habits of compulsive striving slowly give way to intentional presence. Even small moments gain richness that was previously obscured by incessant evaluation and comparison. In this quiet space, life begins to feel lighter, not because it has changed externally, but because perception has shifted. There is also a subtle transformation in how challenges are experienced. When expectations loosen, obstacles do not trigger disproportionate distress. Situations are faced with measured attention rather than reactive tension. The mind engages with reality as it unfolds rather than forcing it into a preferred shape. Freedom from attachment does not eliminate effort, it refines it. Actions are guided by insight and judgment, not by anxiety or compulsion. Even discomfort becomes a teacher, an occasion for observation rather than an object of resistance. In this way, peace is not a static state, but a dynamic engagement with the present, where clarity and equanimity coexist with life's inevitable uncertainties. As this awareness deepens, relationships, work, and daily interactions gain a new texture. Without the need for validation or constant comparison, engagement becomes more authentic. Conversations are less performative and more present. Tasks are approached with clarity and deliberation rather than with fear of failure or anticipation of reward. The mind, no longer burdened by constant striving, finds space to respond creatively and deliberately. In subtle ways, the quality of experience improves. The world is no longer measured solely by what is gained or achieved, but by what is observed, absorbed, and lived fully in each moment. Ultimately, the shift is not dramatic, but cumulative. It is the gradual loosening of tension, the conscious observation of patterns, the acceptance that not all thoughts and feelings are to be controlled. The paradox is profound. In releasing the compulsion to force outcomes, the mind discovers freedom, clarity, and stability. Happiness is no longer a distant prize, but a byproduct of mindful engagement. The effort that remains is deliberate, precise, and aligned with internal values rather than imposed by external pressures. Life becomes less a struggle to control and more an opportunity to experience, understand, and respond. If you've found these ideas resonating and want to continue cultivating clarity and inner freedom, consider subscribing. It's a choice to reflect more deeply, observe your mind with attention, and practice Stoic principles in daily life. That idea can feel subtle at first, almost too simple to take seriously. But when you begin to observe it, it becomes difficult to ignore. A feeling arises, maybe discomfort, maybe restlessness, and almost immediately, a judgment follows. This shouldn't be here. I don't want this. Something is wrong. And in that moment, the experience changes. What was once just a sensation becomes a problem, not because of what it is, but because of how it's being interpreted. This is where conflict begins, not in the feeling itself, but in the rejection of it. You're no longer just experiencing something, you're resisting it, and that resistance splits your attention. Part of you is feeling, another part is pushing back. That division creates tension, and that tension is often what people mistake for the original problem. The Stoics understood this deeply. Epictetus expressed it clearly when he said, "Men are disturbed not by things, but by the views which they take of them." That line points directly to the source of the struggle. It's not the discomfort that traps you, it's the belief that the discomfort shouldn't exist. Once that belief is in place, everything changes. You start trying to fix what isn't actually broken. You start chasing a version of yourself that doesn't feel what you're feeling. And in doing so, you move further away from any sense of stability. Because now, your peace depends on conditions being perfect, on thoughts being quiet, on emotions behaving a certain way, and life rarely works like that. So instead of asking how to remove discomfort, the Stoic approach shifts the question entirely. It asks whether discomfort needs to be removed at all, whether it's possible that the experience itself is neutral and it's only your interpretation that turns it into something negative. That's not an easy shift to make because it challenges something deeply ingrained, the idea that feeling good is the goal and feeling bad is something to avoid. But what if that division is where the problem begins? The moment you label something as bad, you create a reason to resist it. And resistance, as you've seen, doesn't make things disappear. It makes them persist. It keeps your attention locked onto the very thing you're trying to move away from. There's a kind of quiet clarity that emerges when you begin to see this pattern, not as a theory, but as something happening in real time. A feeling arises, and instead of reacting immediately, you notice the judgment forming. You see the urge to push it away. And for a moment, you don't follow that urge. You let the experience exist without interference. At first, that can feel unnatural, almost uncomfortable in a different way, because you're used to doing something about what you feel. Letting it be can feel like inaction, but it's not passive, it's deliberate. It's choosing not to add anything unnecessary to the experience. And in that space, something subtle begins to shift. The feeling may still be there, but it's no longer amplified by resistance. It's not being constantly checked, measured, or judged. It's just there, and because of that, it begins to move on its own. Not because you forced it to, but because you stopped holding it in place. This doesn't mean every feeling disappears quickly or easily. Some linger, some return. But the relationship changes. You're no longer trapped in a cycle of reaction. You're not trying to control what isn't directly controllable, and that alone reduces a significant amount of unnecessary tension. Over time, this approach builds a different kind of stability. Not one that depends on everything feeling right, but one that remains steady even when things don't. Because your sense of balance isn't tied to the absence of discomfort, it's rooted in how you relate to it. And that's the quiet shift the Stoics were pointing to. Not a dramatic transformation, but a reorientation. From control to understanding, from resistance to acceptance, from constantly fixing your internal state to simply observing it without judgment. It doesn't remove life's challenges. It doesn't make everything easy, but it changes the way those challenges are experienced. And sometimes that's the difference between feeling overwhelmed and feeling grounded. The moment you stop treating every uncomfortable experience as something that needs to be eliminated, you begin to see that many of them were never as powerful as they seemed. They were just amplified by the way you were holding them. Desire has a subtle way of presenting itself as necessity. It wears the guise of reason, often whispering that you must achieve more, be more, or possess more. You tell yourself that a promotion will make life better, that recognition will validate your worth, that accumulating experiences will fill an emptiness inside. Each of these thoughts feels logical, even urgent, as if they are requirements for survival. And yet, beneath that logic lies a quieter, more pervasive assumption that the present moment, the current version of yourself, is insufficient, that where you are now is lacking, that you cannot simply exist here without striving further. It is this hidden layer of judgment that fuels the persistent sense of scarcity in life, the feeling that no matter what you do, it will never be enough. The more closely you examine it, the more you see how desire constructs its own momentum. You pursue something you believe will fill a void, and each step reinforces the idea that you are incomplete. The goal, rather than providing relief, becomes a measure of inadequacy. Every obstacle, every delay, every minor shortfall is interpreted as evidence of your insufficiency. And in this way, desire becomes both the problem and the lens through which you view the problem. You may think you are chasing fulfillment, yet you are in fact chasing a reflection of absence. The mind begins to equate achievement with self-worth, and you begin to believe that your contentment depends on conditions outside of your immediate influence. Consider how often these perceived necessities infiltrate ordinary life. You believe you need recognition from peers, but underlying that is a deeper question. Do you believe your own judgment of yourself is inadequate? You pursue status or accolades, yet the moment they are achieved, the mind quickly recalibrates, setting the bar slightly higher, slightly further away. Confidence, fulfillment, and success all are framed as requirements for contentment, yet contentment itself is postponed indefinitely. Each desire masquerades as an urgent mandate, compelling action and attention, reinforcing the perception that the present moment is insufficient. The mind, caught in this rhythm, rarely pauses to evaluate the cost of its own pursuit. What begins as ambition subtly transforms into compulsion. There is no visible malice, no conscious intent to suffer, yet the pattern is powerful. The mind interprets desire as evidence of inadequacy. It interprets striving as a solution rather than a symptom. Each effort, each step, validates the narrative that something essential is missing. And while the external markers of success or accomplishment might increase, the internal sense of completeness remains elusive. This is why the pursuit of goals can sometimes feel hollow. The journey is fueled not by intrinsic aspiration, but by the pressure of an internal vacuum that cannot be satisfied externally. There is a delicate distinction here that is often overlooked. Desire, when recognized as a natural impulse, is not inherently harmful. Striving for growth, setting meaningful objectives, and seeking improvement are integral to human experience. The problem arises when desire is mistaken for necessity, when external achievement is interpreted as the primary source of stability. The Stoics taught that the locus of control, the center of agency, resides within judgment and choice, not in events beyond one's influence. Anchoring fulfillment to impermanent outcomes is inherently precarious. By redirecting attention to what is under your control, the mind gains freedom from the relentless cycle of craving and dissatisfaction. The consequences of misunderstanding this dynamic are subtle but profound. They manifest as restlessness, impatience, and a pervasive sense of insufficiency. The mind continually evaluates itself against shifting standards, constantly measuring what it lacks rather than appreciating what it holds. This creates a tension between presence and pursuit, where even moments of success are tinged with the awareness of what remains unachieved. Desire, when misapplied, functions as both motivator and prison, propelling action while simultaneously fostering a sense of emptiness. It is a paradox that has engaged thinkers for millennia. The very drive meant to secure satisfaction often guarantees its elusiveness. Over time, the consequences of this discernment are profound. Freed from the illusion that fulfillment depends on external acquisition, the mind develops a steadier, more resilient orientation. The focus shifts from chasing absent conditions to engaging fully with the present. Satisfaction becomes less contingent on outcome and more aligned with perception, with judgment, with the internal faculties over which you maintain influence. Desire no longer functions as a tyrant, subtly shaping experience and reinforcing lack. Instead, it becomes a tool, a means for growth without enslavement. The more you practice this awareness, the more you experience a quiet liberation. The recognition that what you are pursuing externally is often already reflected internally once the lens of compulsion is removed. The Stoics knew that this insight does not eliminate all ambition or effort. It does, however, reframe the relationship with striving. By recognizing that attaching well-being to external conditions fosters dependency, you gain the capacity to pursue goals without becoming psychologically bound to them. Each choice, each action, is informed by clarity rather than urgency. The mind becomes less reactive, more deliberate, and more attuned to what is under its own governance. In this way, the cycle of chasing absence can be softened, and the underlying presence of sufficiency, often obscured by craving, can be acknowledged and embraced. There's a subtle transformation that occurs the moment you release the constant pursuit of something beyond your reach. Not by abandoning action, not by settling into indifference, but by recalibrating the relationship between effort and expectation. When the mind no longer ties its sense of worth or contentment to external outcomes, a remarkable shift begins to emerge. It's not about halting ambition or ceasing to move forward. Action continues, plans are executed, responsibilities are met, but without the invisible burden of dependence on a specific result. This is the kind of focus that allows the mind to operate with clarity and resilience, because energy is no longer spent on chasing an illusion of certainty that the world can rarely provide. The first moments of this shift can feel strange, even uncomfortable. There is a part of us that has been conditioned to equate forward motion with progress, striving with purpose, and attachment with meaning. And when those equations are upended, the mind initially resists. It wonders if letting go means giving up. But the Stoics offer a different perspective. Freedom is not found in avoiding effort, but in redefining its direction. It lies in acting with intention while recognizing that outcomes are often beyond direct control. In this framework, the same action that once felt charged with anxiety now becomes steady and deliberate, informed by wisdom rather than compulsion. Seneca once remarked, "True happiness is to enjoy the present without anxious dependence upon the future." This insight captures the essence of the transformation. It is not a call to passivity or retreat. It is a reorientation of effort toward what is within one's domain. The mind becomes anchored in what it can influence, rather than being buffeted by what it cannot. This is freedom from attachment, not freedom from activity. And the paradox is that in loosening the grip on specific outcomes, life's experiences gain a new depth and texture, unclouded by constant evaluation or judgment. The process also reshapes the way challenges are encountered. Obstacles no longer trigger disproportionate anxiety or fear because the mind is not equating difficulty with personal inadequacy. Instead, events are experienced as they occur, and responses emerge from discernment rather than reaction. The Stoics emphasized that suffering arises not from the events themselves, but from judgments about them. By focusing effort on the present and relinquishing attachment to outcomes, the mind discovers a resilience that was previously obscured. Problems remain, but the way they are experienced transforms entirely, moving from burden to manageable reality. This subtle shift also changes relationships with others. When the inner state is no longer contingent upon external validation, interactions become less performative and more authentic. Expectations recede, and empathy can take root in a way that was previously hindered by the preoccupation with self-interest and perceived deficiencies. Conversations, collaborations, and shared experiences gain a quality of presence that had been absent when attachment dominated thought. The mind is free to respond rather than react, and the relational dynamic becomes less about measurement and more about connection. Even creativity and productivity evolve under this paradigm. When actions are untethered from outcome-based anxiety, they are infused with intention and clarity. Ideas can be explored without the constriction of immediate approval or fear of failure. Tasks are approached for their inherent value and alignment with purpose rather than as instruments to secure a sense of worth. This is where effort becomes precise and powerful, and where the mind can engage fully with life, rather than being consumed by chasing a mirage of fulfillment that continually shifts with circumstance. An interesting paradox emerges. The more the mind relinquishes attachment, the more fully it engages. There is no contradiction here. Freedom from attachment does not equate to disengagement or passivity. It creates the conditions for action that is informed, deliberate, and unencumbered by the weight of unnecessary expectation. In that state, the quality of experience transforms. Joy, satisfaction, and even contentment are no longer contingent on achievement, because they have been untangled from the fragile scaffolding of desire. Life begins to flow with an organic rhythm, less forced, more coherent, and subtly more profound. The act of stopping the chase does not mean abandoning responsibility or ambition. It means accepting that not everything is within your direct control and choosing where to direct your energy with discernment. By disentangling effort from attachment, you discover a space where action is meaningful, yet free from the compulsion to manipulate every outcome. The Stoic perspective teaches that peace is cultivated not by mastering events themselves, but by mastering the judgments, perceptions, and attitudes you bring to them. In this framework, the mind is not idle, but liberated. It can navigate complexity with precision, equanimity, and resilience, responding to life rather than being consumed by the illusion that controlling everything is possible. This is not about laziness or disengagement. On the contrary, life continues in its natural flow. You still take steps, you still act, you still face challenges. But the difference lies in the absence of the invisible weight you previously carried, the weight of expectation, the tension of forced satisfaction. Without it, you can experience life directly, without interference. Each sensation, each encounter, each thought arrives without being filtered through judgment. The clarity that emerges is subtle, yet powerful, creating a sense of equilibrium that was previously obstructed by the compulsion to constantly evaluate, adjust, and perfect. The experience is remarkably similar to falling asleep. No one ever drifts into sleep by demanding it, by thinking of it incessantly, or by forcing the mind into a state it is not ready for. Sleep emerges when the mind and body release the need to control, when attention is allowed to settle naturally. Happiness, inner calm or peace behaves much the same way. It is not a construct to be forcibly built, nor a prize to be won through relentless striving. It arises when the effort to capture it stops. And yet, even with this understanding, most people continue to approach peace as if it were a goal to be attained, a trophy to be secured, as if its value increases with the intensity of the pursuit. There's a certain irony here. The more tightly you clutch after happiness, the more it seems to slip through your fingers. Each attempt to secure it amplifies its elusiveness, and yet the pattern persists. Humans have a peculiar tendency to confuse effort with efficacy, to believe that the degree of struggle directly correlates with reward. But the mind operates differently when it comes to internal states. It thrives under observation without obsession, under presence without compulsion. The very act of letting go, of releasing the need to achieve, creates conditions in which happiness can emerge organically, without force. Carl Jung once suggested that, "I am not what happened to me, I am what I choose to become." This perspective captures the subtle power of the shift we're exploring. By stepping out of the compulsion to shape every moment, to orchestrate every outcome, you open a space in which choice and perception regain their rightful authority. You are no longer at the mercy of every passing sensation, every transient feeling, or every comparison to an imagined ideal. Instead, you inhabit a space of awareness, a space that allows life to unfold, while your attention observes rather than coerces. When tension dissolves, the quality of perception itself transforms. Moments that once felt heavy with expectation now feel lighter, more vivid, more immediate. You notice things that were previously overlooked: the subtle interplay of light and shadow in a room, the cadence of someone's voice, the rhythm of your own breath. Small experiences acquire a richness previously overshadowed by the constant preoccupation with outcomes. This is not mere poetic embellishment. It is the mind recalibrating to operate without the interference of relentless striving. Space emerges not as emptiness, but as an arena in which genuine engagement becomes possible. There's also an extraordinary freedom that comes with this shift. When you're no longer trying to engineer happiness, the instinctive tension that accompanies evaluation, comparison, and measurement fades. You're no longer trapped in an internal treadmill, constantly checking whether you've arrived or assessing your worth against a shifting standard. Without the pressure, decisions can be made with greater clarity. Actions are no longer preemptively burdened by fear of failure or disappointment. Thought processes operate with greater flexibility, allowing creativity, insight, and intuition to arise unhindered. The mind finds its equilibrium not through control, but through a kind of responsive stillness. Even the perception of time begins to change. The relentless ticking of the internal clock, measuring progress, judging adequacy, and anticipating the next moment, slows. Experience becomes richer because it is absorbed rather than filtered. Each interaction, each sensation, each event is processed in its own rhythm, free from the overlay of compulsion. The mind, unshackled from the incessant demand for happiness as a product, experiences existence more fully. This is the paradox. Freedom arises not from acquiring, achieving, or striving, but from stepping back, relinquishing control, and allowing presence to settle. Engagement with life deepens when tension fades. Tasks, responsibilities, and ambitions are approached with precision rather than anxiety. Attention is clearer, motivation is sharper, and effort is more deliberate. Actions are guided not by the compulsion to achieve validation or satisfaction, but by choice and purpose. This is not disengagement, it is refined engagement. The same energy that once fueled anxious striving now operates under deliberate guidance. The mind navigates challenges with composure rather than compulsion, and decisions emerge from discernment rather than reaction. And there is a profound peace in realizing that happiness does not need to be captured, controlled, or manufactured. It is already present, waiting to emerge when interference ceases. The process of letting go does not negate action, it enhances it. Life unfolds with a new rhythm, not dictated by the pursuit of an ideal, but by the acceptance of what is. In this space, resilience grows, perspective widens, and the subtleties of experience become accessible in ways previously obscured. Freedom from forced striving does not diminish life, it enriches it. This shift in perspective reframes the nature of engagement entirely. When the mind is free from attachment to outcome, effort becomes precise, perception becomes unclouded, and experiences become unforced. Each moment holds its own integrity, no longer weighed down by the invisible pressure of expectation. And in this environment, happiness and peace are no longer goals to chase, but byproducts of a mind allowed to settle. The more the mind releases the compulsion to control, the more fully it inhabits its own space, responding to life rather than attempting to manipulate it into a predetermined shape. There's a rhythm to life that most people overlook. From the moment you wake, routines, behaviors, and expectations begin to shape the way your mind experiences reality. Habits form silently, almost invisibly, guiding reactions and judgments long before conscious thought arrives. One of the most pervasive habits is the assumption that effort inevitably produces results. You are taught from an early age that trying harder, pushing further, striving for more guarantees reward. And in many areas of life, this is true. External achievements, skills, and material gains generally follow effort. Yet when it comes to the inner world, thoughts, emotions, and the elusive quality of contentment, the rules do not apply in the same way. The more you attempt to wrestle your mind into submission, the more entangled you become in the web of your own attention. The Stoics observed this distinction centuries ago, and they recognized its profound implications. They were not interested in removing discomfort from life. They knew that suffering is inevitable, that obstacles are universal, that feelings of unease arise without warning. The question then is not whether discomfort exists, it always will, but how one relates to it. Epictetus noted, "It's not what happens to you, but how you react to it that matters." This principle reframes the pursuit entirely. Instead of attempting to eradicate negative feelings, the wise person cultivates the ability to remain unaffected by their presence, to observe without entanglement, to act with clarity even amid internal turbulence. The distinction is subtle but transformative. The effort is redirected from control to comprehension, from reaction to understanding. Habit also manifests in the repetition of expectations. You assume that each moment must conform to a standard, that each thought must be productive, that each emotion must feel appropriate. And when these expectations are unmet, disappointment, frustration, or anxiety arise. The pattern becomes a form of self-reinforcing tension. Effort to control breeds resistance. Resistance magnifies the original state. Tension escalates. Over time, these conditioned patterns operate largely unconsciously, creating a persistent undercurrent of struggle. The mind learns that dissatisfaction is the default, that control is necessary, that achievement of a particular mental state is essential. And this subtle conditioning perpetuates cycles of unease and effort that rarely yield the results expected. Understanding the nature of habit in this context requires a shift in perspective. Instead of focusing on the content of thought or the presence of feeling, attention turns to the mechanisms of the mind itself. Observe how desire, judgment, and compulsion arise automatically, how the urge to control surfaces repeatedly, and how repeated attempts to eliminate discomfort strengthen the pattern rather than weaken it. This process of observation is not passive. It is active engagement with the structure of consciousness. It allows the mind to notice its tendencies without immediate reaction, fostering a distance between stimulus and response that dissolves the compulsion to force outcomes. Recognition of the habitual nature of internal struggle becomes the first step toward liberation. There is a subtle power in releasing the insistence on control. The mind begins to experience a reduction in self-generated pressure, allowing clarity to emerge where once there was tension. Effort is no longer invested in futile attempts to dictate inner states. Instead, it is directed toward deliberate actions aligned with reason and intention, tasks and engagements chosen with awareness rather than anxiety. This creates a feedback loop of genuine efficacy. The less the mind is forced to control itself, the more it can operate effectively, respond creatively, and experience states of stability that are resistant to perturbation. The paradox is that the less you try to control, the more capable and adaptable the mind becomes. Discomfort itself begins to lose its intensity when the habitual compulsion to resist is interrupted. Emotional states arise, persist briefly, and fade naturally. The pressure to manipulate, manage, or eliminate these states diminishes. Observation without interference allows the mind to experience a state without amplifying it. Small disturbances no longer cascade into crises. Tension that once seemed inseparable from the experience of life gradually loosens. In this way, the mind cultivates resilience, not by eliminating challenge, but by transforming the habitual approach to challenge into one of calm discernment and measured engagement. The implications extend beyond personal experience to decision-making, interaction, and growth. When habitual compulsion is moderated, choices are made with greater clarity, responses are deliberate rather than reactive, and action is guided by understanding rather than anxiety. The rhythm of thought becomes less erratic, the flow of attention more coherent, and the quality of engagement with the world more consistent. In effect, the mind is liberated from self-imposed constraints that previously distorted perception and response. Internal effort is optimized not by intensity, but by alignment with principles of awareness, reflection, and judicious application of energy. This shift cultivates a mental environment in which growth, insight, and presence flourish naturally. Even long-standing anxieties and recurring emotional patterns begin to transform under this approach. Habits of judgment, comparison, and resistance, once automatic, are interrupted by conscious awareness. Each interruption diminishes the strength of the cycle, weakening the association between stimulus and compulsion. Over time, the habitual response of entanglement with internal states is replaced by one of calm observation and adaptive engagement. The mind begins to experience freedom not as the absence of difficulty, but as the absence of unnecessary internal struggle. It is a subtle yet profound recalibration, one that aligns effort with capacity and intention, not compulsion or illusion. By embracing the Stoic distinction between external control and internal response, the patterns of habit that previously constrained experience begin to loosen. Effort is redirected from attempting to force inner states toward understanding and acceptance. The mind learns to navigate life's complexities with composure and precision, responding to reality as it unfolds rather than attempting to bend it to a preconceived notion of ideal. And in this shift, the paradox is revealed. The very effort to control, when moderated and redirected, enhances the capacity for stability, clarity, and authentic engagement with life. There is a subtle shift that occurs when the focus moves away from the relentless pursuit of external goals toward a careful examination of the mind itself. The question is no longer how to acquire, achieve, or accumulate more, but rather what habits of thought and expectation have created a persistent sense of absence. These invisible patterns of judgment, comparison, and desire shape perception in ways that are rarely recognized. You are conditioned to measure yourself against ideals that may never have existed, to treat satisfaction as something that must be earned, and to believe that the present is insufficient. This conditioning is subtle, yet its effects are profound, quietly coloring every experience with the tension of unmet expectations. The mind is so accustomed to this rhythm that it rarely questions it, yet once attention is turned toward it, the pattern begins to reveal itself. As awareness deepens, it becomes evident how much energy has been invested in sustaining these invisible expectations. Every thought, every moment of comparison, every small evaluation contributes to the perception that life is lacking. You anticipate, you plan, you strive, not just for tangible outcomes, but for the reassurance that life is proceeding correctly. Yet the very act of clinging to these standards amplifies the sense of inadequacy. The irony is that the more you attempt to create certainty or control, the more fragile your inner equilibrium becomes. Effort is applied to what is already present, yet unseen, and in this paradox, the sense of deprivation persists. Recognition of this dynamic is the first step toward loosening the hold that expectation has over experience. The Stoics taught that much of human dissatisfaction arises not from circumstances themselves, but from judgments imposed upon them. When the mind insists that life must appear a certain way, it produces resistance and tension whenever reality deviates from that imagined ideal. Marcus Aurelius reminded us, "The happiness of your life depends upon the quality of your thoughts." This statement highlights the radical yet simple principle that inner peace is determined less by external events and more by how they are perceived. By recognizing the patterns that create the feeling of lack, you begin to untangle expectation from experience, allowing life to be seen more clearly, in its unadorned, unmanipulated form. Loosening expectations does not mean lowering standards or abandoning ambition. It means releasing the compulsion to make reality conform to a personal script. It is the shift from a mindset of scarcity and obligation toward one of openness and receptivity. The more tightly the mind grasps for a predetermined outcome, the more constricted experience becomes. The less it grasps, the more space arises for subtleties, for nuance, for life as it unfolds. Even small reductions in mental rigidity create an observable difference in perception. The weight of constant evaluation and judgment begins to ease. What was once experienced as a relentless treadmill of striving now presents itself as a landscape in which the mind can operate with greater freedom and composure. This recalibration of expectation transforms relationships too. Interactions are no longer dominated by a need for validation or affirmation because the internal standard of sufficiency is no longer tied entirely to external confirmation. Social dynamics become less a measure of adequacy and more an opportunity for engagement. Communication occurs with clarity, not under the burden of comparison or anticipation. Attention is freed to observe and respond rather than to measure and defend. In this space, authenticity emerges naturally because the mind is no longer preoccupied with ensuring that every action aligns with an idealized standard. The absence of rigid expectation enhances presence, allowing engagement with life to be richer, more flexible, and more immediate. Even ordinary experiences gain depth under this framework. Activities that were once performed with underlying tension, meals, walks, conversations, work, begin to feel less burdened by internal commentary. There is less analysis, less internal debate, less questioning of whether the moment is being fully utilized. Life becomes lighter not because external conditions have changed, but because the internal framework has. The subtle loosening of expectation creates space for enjoyment, for appreciation, and for the perception of abundance that had previously been obscured. This is the quiet power of attention applied to the mind rather than the world. It allows the richness of the present to emerge unimpeded. The process also shifts the relationship to desire itself. When expectations are no longer rigidly imposed, desire can be recognized for what it is, a natural inclination rather than a mandate for satisfaction. The mind can pursue goals, seek experiences, and engage in personal development without mistaking these activities for the primary source of contentment. Effort becomes precise and deliberate, aligned with values and intention rather than reactive or compulsive. In the absence of constant pressure, actions are taken with clarity and purpose, creating a sense of agency that had been previously masked by the need to chase outcomes. The mind begins to inhabit its own capacity for discernment rather than being driven by unconscious compulsions. In this space, life unfolds with a sense of balance that was previously inaccessible. The absence of relentless striving does not equate to passivity. Rather, it allows engagement to be measured, intentional, and harmonious. Experiences are not colored by the compulsion to secure or control, but observed with attentiveness and equanimity. Internal freedom grows, not through accumulation or achievement, but through the gentle release of expectation. Paradoxically, it is in letting go of rigid demands that the mind gains the clarity and perspective to act with true discernment. The quality of experience improves because the energy previously consumed by compulsive striving is redirected toward awareness and intentional presence. The final revelation of this shift is subtle yet profound. When expectations loosen, the mind is capable of perceiving richness that was always present but obscured by the weight of compulsion. Moments of connection, beauty, insight and insight unfold naturally, without being forced into a framework of adequacy. Effort, when guided by awareness rather than anxiety, becomes a tool for engagement rather than a measure of worth. Happiness, satisfaction, and contentment are no longer distant or contingent. They arise organically from a mind free from the tyranny of rigid expectation. In this liberation, you discover what effort alone could never provide: a sense of fullness, of presence, and of connection that is internally anchored rather than externally dependent. The quiet freedom you've been searching for has always been within reach, not in chasing, forcing, or controlling, but in letting go, observing, and allowing life to unfold as it is. Every moment becomes richer, every breath steadier, and every experience more alive when you release the weight of expectation and attachment. This is the peace that effort alone can never give, the clarity that comes when you stop trying to hold what cannot be held, and the strength that grows when you simply stand present in your own mind. Thank you for being a part of Stoic Journal. If you want to continue this journey, explore one of the suggested videos on the screen and see how these principles can deepen your practice and transform the way you experience each day.